Back before cell phones and TSA checkpoints, I was an administrative assistant. Ray was my department head and had a great sense of humor. When I was hired, Ray made sure I understood that I worked for him, even though I would do some office-wide work. He was my boss. Clint was in charge of another department in our office. People in both departments often flew from our office to a satellite office for a day or two, and I was in charge of making standard pre-approved travel arrangements. If someone needed to change unexpectedly, they were supposed to handle those themselves. Clint seemed unable to understand that. At some point, Clint decided that he wanted to cut travel costs. Lowest possible fare, lowest possible rate for his department. The lowest possible fares were always the 5 a.m. outbound and 11 p.m. return flights. Clint didn't care. A couple of weeks into this policy, Clint is headed to the satellite office for some in-person meetings. Game on. Lowest possible fare, lowest possible rate. Clint left on the 5 a.m. flight. The lowest rate car rental company didn't keep their cars available at the airport. Clint had to take the shuttle to their off-site location to pick up his car. Sadly for Clint, the shuttle didn't start running until 8, when his first meeting was scheduled to begin. Oops. The client refused to reschedule that day, but agreed to the next morning. At some point, it dawned on Clint that he either had to fly home and back or get a room for the night. He chose to get a room and, of course, call me to arrange it. One lowest possible rate room coming up. Unsurprisingly, that room didn't have security on site like he was used to. It did have little multi-legged friends if his complaints were true. The next morning, Clint headed out, in the previous day's suit, only to discover that his car had been broken into overnight. The police took their time arriving, and by the time they were done, Clint had missed his meeting again. Somehow, Clint got the client to reschedule, again, and he decided to take the flight home and back the next day. Of course, I was kind enough to remember the lowest possible fare rule, so Clint was booked on the 11 p.m. flight home and 5 a.m. return, even though his meeting was midday. This time, the lowest rate car was at the airport, so Clint got to skip the shuttle. Sigh, you can't win them all. At that point, Clint's lowest possible policy had already cost the company at least double the cost of a normal trip, not to mention all the time I had spent calling hotels, motels, and car rental companies. The next day, he's on the 5 a.m. flight and makes it to his meeting. I don't know when he realized he didn't want the lowest possible fare at 11 p.m. I do know he decided to take the more expensive, earlier flight home on both days. Somehow he discovered that he could change that himself. The next time I saw Clint, he tried to fire me. Too bad I worked for Ray, who knew and laughed about the whole thing. Clint was furious, but there wasn't anything he could do. The company would back Ray, and Ray was backing me. Because of his experience, Clint changed the room rate policy, but refused to rescind the lowest fare and rental rate policy. That was until accounting let slip that not only had Clint figured out how to take the higher-priced earlier flight, but he also figured out how to get an upgraded seat. Clint found himself with an entire department intentionally missing their 5 a.m. flights and rebooking for the more expensive 8 a.m., which somehow only had upgraded seats available every time. Rental car reservations were missed, and more expensive cars were rented. Meetings that were previously in the office were somehow only available after hours, so clients were taken to dinner. Dinner included alcohol, so rooms were booked at hotels closest to the restaurants, and returning flights were scheduled for the next day. Less than a month later, all the policies for the lowest prices were rescinded. I was allowed to book normally again, and the missed flights, upgraded seats, and fancy hotels disappeared. Dinner meetings remained, but decreased dramatically. When I left, Clint's reputation still hadn't recovered.